Hi, I'm Patrick Scott, and welcome back to PLS 101, American Democracy and Citizenship. Today we're going to be talking about an institution known as bureaucracy. We're going to dissect bureaucracy, and as part of this discussion, in the next couple of discussions, we're going to be talking about things like, besides the history of bureaucracy, but also issues like what factors account for the growth of bureaucracy over time, and also what strategies are there to help control bureaucracy. And we'll leave you with the discussion is do we have adequate controls in bureaucracy? Is bureaucracy raging out of control? So we'll talk about some of those issues as well. I should also tell you a little bit too about my background at this point, because I used to be a former bureaucrat. Before I obtained my PhD, I used to work for a couple of different agencies in Washington, D.C. I worked for the Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration, and then it became part of the Bureau of Export Administration. And then also I worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, their Office of Productivity and Management Improvement. So I've had a fair amount of experience in terms of working on the inside of bureaucracy, and I feel like, this of course is an area where I had studied and obtained my PhD. So I feel like I know a little bit about bureaucracy here, and I'll be hopefully be able to share some insights about bureaucracy with you. Now, when we think about bureaucracy, we obviously come up with some very negative stereotypes. In a lot of ways, let me tell you first of all, it's kind of like what we have with Congress. You know, when we talked about Congress, we pointed out, we made the point that we don't like Congress in the abstract. When we think about Congress as an institution, we often have negative stereotypes, but yet we like our own member of Congress that we keep sending back and forth over and over again back to Washington. So we love our own individual member of Congress, but we don't like Congress as an institution. Well, in the same way, there's a little bit of a parallel between Congress and bureaucracy in that regard. When we talk about bureaucracy sort of in the abstract, we often have very negative stereotypes, but yet when we start dealing with bureaucracy on a day-to-day basis, oftentimes, more often than not, our experiences tend to be more positive than negative, and a lot of empirical research has shown that to be the case. Well, again, looking at bureaucracy in the abstract here, we often have very negative stereotypes. We think about bureaucrats as being lazy or incompetent or self-serving. We think about bureaucracy as being too large, inefficient, and those kinds of images come to mind. And as the textbook points out, a lot of these conceptions of bureaucracy are really myths, and these myths often stem from a lack of knowledge about what the bureaucracy is and what it does. Now, I heard an interesting quote one time, and I thought I would share this with you. The quote says this: "Bureaucrats are people we hate in the abstract, but cannot do without in the concrete." In a lot of ways, I would say to you that if it weren't for bureaucracy, bureaucracy to me is where, as far as government is concerned, is where the rubber meets the road. Because, for example, Congress can pass laws all day long, but until those laws are actually implemented, executed, turned into public policies, tangible programs and services that are designed to achieve their intended goals, you don't have government. I mean, government, basically, the expression and manifestation of government is basically seen most clearly in the actions of bureaucracy. Now, bureaucracy and bureaucrats in particular are handy targets to blame for society's ills. But the truth is, government could not function without bureaucrats. Many government programs are very complex, and they require experts and professional people to administer them. The very bureaucrats that we blame for red tape are also the same people who help put astronauts on the moon, who create vaccines, who develop the most technologically sophisticated military that the world has ever seen. And then on a more mundane level, these are the very same people who administer the nation's public parks, who process your passports, who make sure your grandparents get their monthly Social Security checks, among a million other kinds of activities. Well, let's talk about bureaucracy in terms of what bureaucracy is. What is bureaucracy? Now, the term itself really means any large, complex organization that's designed to carry out specific tasks within a system of hierarchy or hierarchical relationships. As you might realize then, a bureaucratic organization can be public or private. Private sector organizations can be bureaucratically organized. So you can find bureaucracy as a form of organization in the public sector or the private sector. And so, in fact, most large corporations are bureaucracies, all right? And so bureaucracy is not just simply within the domain of government within the public sector. Now, also in some background about bureaucracy, our original conception of the term of bureaucracy comes from a sociologist, a German sociologist who lived in the 1800s named Max Weber. And Max Weber had written about a lot of different things, but he's often considered as the father of bureaucracy because he's one of the first who pretty much explicated what bureaucracy is and its impact on society. And one of the points that he makes is that what's unique about bureaucracy is the fact that it embodies technical expertise. It's staffed with experts, and that expertise becomes a source of power for bureaucracy. And that source of power can be used for good or for bad in our society. And back during Weber's day, one of the things that he actually looked at bureaucracy, he saw bureaucracy as being a highly efficient machine, almost reflecting his Prussian background, like a war machine, a Prussian war machine. He saw bureaucracy organized that way. And he even made the argument that were it not for bureaucracy as a form of organization, Western civilization would not have developed the way it did. He said that bureaucracy was the practical carrier of Western civilization. Now, when we use the term bureaucracy and government, we're talking really about government. We're talking about the myriad of agencies and departments and the people who work in them. They apply at the local, state, and federal level, though most of our focus will be at the federal level. And interestingly, if you go back to the Constitution and you look for the term bureaucracy, you're not going to find anything in there. There are some allusions to carrying out executive functions, but the Constitution really makes no mention of bureaucracy. And today, interestingly, bureaucracy is often referred to as the fourth branch of government, although there really are only three branches, and bureaucracy is part of the executive branch, but many people have looked at bureaucracy because of its immense power and size and scope as being the fourth branch of government. Now, you might say that because bureaucracy is part of the executive branch, that the president is ultimately in charge of the bureaucracy because he is the chief executive. Bureaucracy is comprised of all the administrative organizations that help to carry out the president's policies and initiatives. Technically, when we're looking at bureaucracy, you have three different, if you were to say, how do we go about and make some sense of all these different agencies that are out there? And there are different kinds of schemas to categorize these different agencies. And here's one I think is pretty useful. You can look at bureaucracy in terms of three basic groups. One group is comprised of all the cabinet departments. That's 15 cabinet departments, Department of State, Department of Treasury, Department of Commerce, Homeland Security, and so forth. So you've got cabinet departments as one category, independent agencies that are not located within these cabinet departments. There are many of these, and I think of, for example, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, are some examples of independent agencies. So you've got cabinet departments, independent agencies, and then various regulatory commissions. So I think, for example, all of the alphabet soup of agencies like the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Consumer Product and Safety Commission. Okay, these are regulatory commissions that are organized a little bit differently, but again outside the traditional cabinet department structure. Now, in terms of numbers, there are over 2.9 million civilian federal employees working in bureaucracy. And 2/3 of them can be found in just 3 agencies: Defense, Veterans Affairs, and the Post Office. Those 3 agencies alone make up about 2/3 of the entire federal bureaucracy. And technically, when we're talking 2.9 million overall, but technically, if you consider all the different government contracts, like military contracts with private industry, defense contractors, then you start thinking about the work that they do. Well, then in that case, there are really a lot more people than just the 2.9 million working for the government. They work indirectly through contract, but if you think about in terms of the overall size of government, if you bring that in, government's much larger than just simply that 2.9 million full-time civilian federal employees. Now, if you look at these civilian federal employees, most of them operate in what's called the career civil service. All right, now these are people who are hired on the basis of their education, their merit, their expertise. All right, now these are the people that your bureaucrats that hold positions that range from clerk typist to top managers to budget analysts to computer programmers to air traffic controllers to accountants to firefighters, to park rangers, to nurses, to physicians, to chemists, to intelligence analysts, defense analysts, the whole gamut of occupations you will find in the federal government. And again, the people who belong to the career civil service are hired on the basis of merit. That is, they are hired on the basis of their skills, their technical training and abilities, and they comprise the bulk of all federal employees. Now, so for example, a person who works as an accountant is an accountant because he or she has had several years of specialized training in accounting, and they may have a degree perhaps to show for that, and as well as perhaps a CPA by passing a CPA exam. And those qualifications is what allows them to become classified as an accountant working in the federal government. So in other words, they're qualified to serve as an accountant because of their specialized training in that area. So you have, the career civil service. Now, you have another group of employees among these civilian federal employees, the 2.9 million, and these are known as political appointees, and we've talked about some of these before in the discussion on the presidency. The political appointees occupy the top positions in government. At the very top, they include the cabinet secretaries, all the secretaries in each of the departments, like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, but also they occupy positions even lower down in the bureaucracy. Still top positions, but as I mentioned before, positions like an undersecretary of a given department, or a deputy undersecretary, or an assistant secretary of a given bureau, a deputy assistant secretary, and so forth. All right, now all of these, the total number of these political appointees are about 4,000 positions that are reserved for political appointees. Now, most of these are placed in bureaucracy. Some of them go beyond bureaucracy. Some of these are also diplomatic appointments, and some of these political appointees are also people that come under this general framework, are also those that the president nominates to serve in the federal judiciary. But in any case, right here, though, a lot of people that come under this umbrella of political appointees, and they serve at the pleasure of the president. Interestingly, the average tenure time for political appointees in bureaucracy is about 18 months. They will serve in a position, the average amount of time for about 18 months. They'll make their mark and then move on to something else, maybe within bureaucracy, or go back outside to private sector employment. And there's a phenomenon known as a revolving door, where they will come in and work for federal government for a while, then go back to the outside and so forth. But in any case, their average tenure is about 18 months. Now, political appointees are not hired on the basis of merit, but on the basis of party and political loyalty. This is also known as patronage. They may have been a friend or a colleague of the president, or maybe a friend of the president, or they could actually be an expert about that shares the president's views on certain areas, and the president has heard about them. So they are basically designed to serve, and the real question is, why do we have so many political appointees, and what's the purpose of this? I mean, after all, one alternative to this would be, why not have all the bureaucracy staffed by people who are hired on the basis of merit? Well, the political appointees are there to ensure that each of the agencies and the departments will carry out the wishes of the president. Think of all these political appointees as being the president's top but massive management team. Since the president is in charge of the entire bureaucracy, he needs a way to make sure that these agencies will do what he says or what he wants, and that the policies will reflect his intentions. So that's why you have this management team at these upper level positions within bureaucracy to help make sure that these agencies carry out his wishes. So what we have here is what we call a system of patronage. It's whether you receive it, it's where you receive a job based on who you know rather than what you know per se. So while many federal jobs are based upon merit, other jobs are based upon patronage. So in other words, many federal employees are hired on the basis of merit, while a significant number are also hired on the basis of patronage. And again, my own background, I was actually hired on the basis of merit. I was hired because I had a master's degree in public administration, but in the course of my job, I worked for people who were patronage-based employees. One person that I worked for example, was a lawyer from Tennessee, and his father happened to be a personal friend of Ronald Reagan. And so this particular person had campaigned in Tennessee for Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and his son was a political appointee, and I worked for his son for a short period of time. To give you a little bit of a background about why we have our bureaucracy created the way we do, this whole patronage system really began with Andrew Jackson, as you may recall back from earlier discussions, during the spoils system. And so when Andrew Jackson became president, he brought in a lot of his political loyalists and former Whigs and former Federalists. He swept house and brought in his people to occupy these top positions in government. We also talked about how over time there was some corruption associated with the spoils system, and in fact it led to, in 1881, the assassination of a president, James Garfield. He was assassinated in 1881 by a disgruntled office seeker. So there began to be calls for reform, saying perhaps we'd gone too far. And so that's where the progressives came in on the scene. You remember when we talked about them earlier, they became prominent in the late 1800s, and the progressives wanted to clean up government. They were opposed to the power of the city bosses and the political machines, as say at the local level, and they wanted to have reforms throughout government. So the progressives believed that government should run like a business. Government should be staffed with experts who know how to do the job. If I'm going to hire you to be a director of public works, it's because you would know something about public works, not because you're my cousin or a friend of mine, instead, or be able to raise money for my campaign. No, you should be hired, according to this viewpoint, you should be hired on the basis of your training and your leadership and your skills in public works. So the progressives began to press for reforms, and one of the most significant pieces of legislation at the federal level, which occurred during this time, was the Pendleton Act, and that was passed in 1883 by Congress. Now, the Pendleton Act is where the merit system first began for federal employees. Initially, only about 10% of existing federal jobs were covered under merit, but soon more and more positions began to be covered under merit-based hiring principles. And firing principles too. You could not be hired except for the basis of merit, and you could not be fired except for incompetence. Now today, over 95% of federal jobs are covered by merit. And again, these are often called the General Services System, the Career Civil Service, the GS7, GS9. Those are some examples of those types of positions that we're talking about. Now, some more background here. Besides merit and career service employees, merit or career service employees, as well as the patronage political appointees, there are other categories that we can look at. There's something called the Senior Executive Service, SES, and this is which is comprised of both top career civil service and top political appointees. But these are your top echelon of managers. And the SES, the Senior Executive Service, was created by the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. And its purpose was to establish a top cadre of managers who could easily transfer from one agency to the next. And it was in a lot of ways modeled after the British civil service system. Now, there are also special jobs that are merit-based but are specialized, and they're covered by their own separate personnel systems. And I think about, for example, the U.S. Foreign Service. So a lot of it, if you're working overseas for the State Department, you're probably covered under the Foreign Service. Now, while most federal employees are white-collar employees, there are a substantial number of wage system employees too, blue-collar jobs such as plumbers, pipe fitters, and so forth. So anyway, so that's sort of an overview of some of the different types of people that you find in bureaucracy. Now, obviously, as you know, they do a lot of important things, but given the size of bureaucracy, the 2.9 million people, an important question that comes to mind is, how did we get such a vast bureaucracy? Why did bureaucracy grow to become so large? Well, first of all, keep in mind that we are talking about 2.9 million people, and that is a lot, but on the other hand, if you compare the 2.9 to other types of sectors in our society, it's really not that big. I mean, for example, that 2.9 million federal employees is a relatively small percentage of the total U.S. labor force. And interestingly enough, it's pretty small when compared to the number of state and local government employees. If you were to combine all the state and local government employees, you're talking about 17 million. So you compare 2.9 million versus 17 million, and you see it helps keep that in perspective. But nonetheless, people still talk about bureaucracy as being very big, gargantuan, inefficient, full of red tape, these kinds of things. Many people believe that bureaucracy got to be so large because it was incompetent, or because it became powerful because it began to serve its own interest, or those of specialized interests and not those of the public as a whole. Well, let me give you, I think, to be essentially, a few basic factors that I think accounts for the growth of bureaucracy over time. One important factor that accounts for the growth of bureaucracy has been the increasing technical complexity of society over time and the public's call for government to respond. As we were developing as a nation, we became more industrialized and more urbanized. You think about the whole process of industrialization and urbanization. We began to move increasingly from the farms to the city. We were shifting away from an agrarian society and moving toward an industrial society. And because of that, because there was a massive influx into the cities, along with buttressed by a tide of immigration, this created new demands upon government, in this case more at the local level for government services. We had to have streets, and we had to have sewers, we had to have education, we had to have police and safety and fire. So all these kinds of trends began to put more demands upon government. And from the 1850s to about 1900s, the number of federal agencies doubled. A good example that I think about is in 1887. That marked the creation of the first regulatory agency, the Interstate Commerce Commission. And the purpose of the ICC was to regulate railroads, because railroads are developing a monopoly, and so through that technology and through changes in our society, some monopolies were beginning to develop, and there was a need for regulating some of these monopolies too. Back then, when the railroads were charging twice as much for a short haul as for a long haul, for example, and that was hurting the economic interest of farmers, they began to call for some regulation. Federal workers were being hired not just to regulate railroads, however, but to deliver the mail as well, and to assist farmers, to manage the federal government's vast land holdings, to survey and help settle newly acquired territories in the West, and promote American commerce overseas. So they were being used for a lot of different activities the federal government was becoming increasingly involved in. So one reason is that just simply the increasing technical complexity of our society and the public's call for government to respond. Now, a related point or a related factor that helps to account for the growth of bureaucracy is this idea about increasing demands of various sectors in our society that were placing on government, demands of interest groups. So if you look at bureaucracy and the different agencies, the growth of bureaucracy can be explained by various groups in our society wanting to have their interest protected. So if you think about this, look at about the Department of Commerce, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Labor are examples of economic interests groups wanting to have their economic interests protected and calling upon government to represent them. Now, a third factor besides that is that the certainly very important one is the attempt to deal with serious economic and social problems of our country. Many more agencies were added as we attempted to respond to the Great Depression under the New Deal. Under the New Deal, many agencies were created, and as I had mentioned before, that really marked the growth of a lot of new agencies. So just to give you a few examples here, the Farm Security Administration, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, to help protect your assets in a bank, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Federal Housing Administration, the Rural Electrification Administration, the Security and Exchange Commission, for example, to regulate the stock markets, the Social Security Administration, and the Tennessee Valley Authority are just a few of the many agencies that were created in the 1930s under Roosevelt's New Deal policies. We also, of course, attempted to deal with the problems of the poor, in particular in the 1960s under President Johnson's Great Society program. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, proposed a number of programs and policies, and during this time, new agencies were also created, additional agencies and services designed to deal with problems of poverty in the inner city. So during this period of time, in the 60s or so, we saw the creation of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which later on was broken up into two separate agencies, Health and Human Services, as well as the Department of Education as a standalone department in the 1970s. But we had HEW that was created during this time. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, also created during this time. So again, the idea of the government trying to respond to increasing social and economic problems in our country, as it could also reflect, is also a reason why government grew in its size and scope. And of course, a fourth reason, and we'd be remiss if we did not mention this, was simply the United States becoming a world leader. World War II, in particular, was responsible for the rise of our defense establishment. And thereafter, the Cold War that we had for many years with the Soviet Union. If we were going to respond to the threats of communism, to the threats to our security, we needed to develop the capability, the institutional capacity to protect ourselves. And those kinds of things call for large armies, large navy, large weapon systems, large intelligence gathering operations, large overseas presence in our embassies, and those kinds of things. So just the demands of being a world leader and to protecting our security also created a need for greater capacity to do so, and that was reflected and manifested in the form of bureaucracy. The National Security Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, but we can go on and on. Now, in general, I guess maybe a fifth factor is that there has been increasing demands for public services and for government to solve all sorts of problems. In a lot of ways, we are ourselves to blame for bureaucracy. You are the cause of bureaucracy being as large as it is. And when I say that, is that because when you make demands upon government and government simply responding to your demands in our pluralist system, one of the ways government responds is by creating new programs or new agencies to deal with those kinds of things, hence more bureaucracy and hence potentially more red tape. But problems in our society dealing with urban decay, to putting someone on the moon, to maintaining a social security system, and to developing an interstate highway system, all of these are reflections of increasing demands for public services and for government to solve problems, and this is simply government responding to those kinds of dynamics. Oftentimes, as a part of this, bureaucracy has increased in size because citizens or interest groups will clamor for Congress to take some action. And so Congress will pass a law to clean up the environment. And so Congress tries to be responsive, as you know. And so Congress is responding to interest groups and to citizens. So it says, look what we're trying to do. And what happens here is that Congress tries to satisfy constituents this way by passing laws, by creating programs or agencies. But then what Congress does is pass the headaches onto bureaucracy to figure out how to solve the problem. So the headaches get passed on to bureaucracy. In a lot of ways, it's much more easy to implement, to craft a law than it is to actually implement that law effectively through a process of regulations, detailed regulations, and technical kinds of regulations that are issued. But nonetheless, Congress may respond by setting up an agency such as the EPA and giving that agency a lot of authority to implement congressional intent. It's saying, okay, yes, we are passing the headache on to the EPA. You figure out the problem. Now here's what we're going to do for you, EPA. Congress is going to be giving you a lot of authority to figure out what to do, a lot of discretion. Now that implementation process can be very complex and involve a lot of scientific technical issues. Congress might want cleaner air, and it passes the Clean Air Act. But how do we actually achieve cleaner air? It doesn't just happen overnight. We've got to figure out, well, what's really polluting the air, right? What particular pollutants create the greatest problem in terms of pollution, and particularly in terms of endangering our long-term health? So we have to focus and analyze what particular chemicals are out there and the source of the pollution, and that can be very complex, very technical, and very detailed. Now, over time, Congress may give that agency more and more responsibility and more money to carry out its various responsibilities. And as you might obviously understand here, that gives the agencies a major source of power. When the agency is given a lot of responsibility, a lot of almost a blank check in terms of saying, you figure out how to deal with this problem, here's the money to deal with it, and you go about creating and implement law or regulations that fulfill the intent of these laws, you figure out the specific details. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that agencies, federal department and agencies, i.e. bureaucracy, has a lot of power because they have a lot of expertise. They're staffed with experts, the people who are trained and who are there on the basis of their technical expertise, the scientists, and those are the chemists, and those who have PhDs in environmental policies. They have the expertise, they have the discretion, they have the resources, they have the authority. And they're charged with some broad mandate and are given the discretion to figure out how to deal with the problem. So they become the technical experts at figuring out how to solve the problem, such as putting someone on the moon or dealing with pollution or nuclear energy, whatever it may be. And again, the people who work for these agencies are experts, and their expertise becomes a very important source of power. Now, also, if you think about this, people who work in bureaucracy tend to enhance their expertise over time because under the merit system basically means that these people are fairly secure in their jobs. Because you have merit-based protections, people are not fired because they have political views that differ from their bosses. When a political appointee comes in, that political appointee cannot fire the technical experts below him or her because they happen to disagree about politics. And in fact, there's a term that's applied often to bureaucrats called neutral competence, and that is no matter who's your boss, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, you simply follow and carry out the policies with competence in a neutral kind of fashion. Well, as I mentioned before, the political appointees have an average tenure in a given position of about 18 months. They're there for about 18 months and then they move on. Well, the long-term expert who's been there for many, many years, they survive these political appointees. And so the ones who really develop the expertise are the ones who've been there for a long, long time. And they're relatively secure in their jobs because they just simply can't be fired willy-nilly. They can only be fired because of incompetence. And so because of that, presidents and political appointees, even members of Congress may come and go, but the experts in bureaucracy will still be there. Many of them will. Their average tenure is much longer, and because of that, over time they develop even more their source of expertise. And a political appointee would be foolish not to rely upon the expertise of those below them. But on the other hand, too, as you might imagine, sometimes this creates tensions between the political appointees at the top and the top career bureaucrats right below them who are experts at what they do. A political appointee may come in and say, we're going to completely revamp what you guys have been doing for the last 5 years, and we're going to simply move in a different direction. And that's obviously going to lead to a lot of resistance and a lot of tension within bureaucracy, and a lot of potentially foot dragging and resistance among career bureaucrats because they may say, well, we've tried this your way before, it doesn't work. But again, those kinds of dynamics can often come into play as well. So anyway, the power of bureaucrats, their power is enhanced or at least maintained as well when they have the support of various interest groups. We talked about a little bit before in our discussion of Congress, this notion of the iron triangle. Some texts refer to iron triangles as a subset of something called policy subgovernments. And at one continuum are the iron triangles, another part of the continuum are issue networks, but these are all part of various groups of actors who are involved in making policy. The iron triangle is a pretty interesting application of this idea of model of policy to subgovernments. The point here is this, as you may recall, when you've got the relevant federal department of agency in any particular given policy area, such as defense, so you've got the Pentagon, the Department of Defense here, as one of the actors of the iron triangle. One of the other actors are interest groups, in this case defense weapons manufacturers, and then another component or actor of the iron triangle are members of Congress, particularly those who are in various committees or subcommittees that deal with armed services or defense. And the idea behind the iron triangle is that they all work to benefit each other's mutual advantage. And they call it the iron triangle because it suggests it's relatively impermeable from outside influences. And to the extent it's effective, it may actually produce more, in this case defense, than what we technically may need. In any case, the point here is that bureaucracy's power is enhanced when it has the support of various interest groups, such as those kinds of actors that you may see operating in this idea of the iron triangle in the different policy areas. And to give you another example besides that, we talked about the Interstate Commerce Commission that was created back in 1887, our first formal agency to regulate private sector entities here. And the ICC was created originally to regulate railroads. Now, over time, as the railroad industry began to wane in terms of its influence, the ICC turned into a very vocal supporter of the railroad interest. And some people say that the ICC became captured, if you will, by the railroad industry. Okay? And they use that as an example of other ways in which agencies can become captured by these interest groups, powerful interest groups. So, for example, is the Department of Health and Human Services captured by the American Medical Association? That would be the analogy that we're talking about here. In a similar way, you can say that the Agriculture Department exists for the benefit of farmers, that the Labor Department exists for the benefit of big labor interest, that the Department of Veterans Affairs serves the interest of veterans, and that the Defense Department serves the interest of the military-industrial complex and defense weapons manufacturers. So, it is true that government is big and that government does a lot of things, and that we expect a lot from government, and that government serves the interest of various groups in our society. As we've talked about this, bureaucracy does have a lot of power. Bureaucrats do more than simply carry out the wishes of elected officials. Again, Congress may pass a vague law and give responsibility to the bureaucracy for trying the best way to figure out how to implement that policy. But what's really interesting here is that that source of power poses potential problems for our democracy. How do we know that bureaucracy will act in the interest of the public and not simply try to carry out its own interest or the interest of some special interest? What can we do to make sure that bureaucracy serves the public interest and, again, not some special interest like that the book calls clientelism? So, given its power and resources, what can we do to make sure that bureaucracy acts responsibly, serving the public and not guided by its own self-interest? In our next session of bureaucracy, we're going to come back and we're going to deal specifically with that problem, with that issue about how do we control bureaucracy. And we're going to deal with the question, is bureaucracy raging out of control or not? And specifically, we'll talk about what are the various types of controls that are in place to help keep bureaucracy in check. So, until then, this is Patrick Scott. We'll see you next time.